I'm sitting in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning in October. The kind of morning where the light comes through the windows all wrong, making everything look like it's already been decided. My hands are in my lap. I'm not shaking. I haven't been shaking for 3 weeks now. The lawyer is saying something about irreversible actions and documented theft. His voice sounds like it's coming from underwater. I'm not really listening to the words anymore. I'm watching his mouth move, watching him turn a document around so I can see the photographs. Photographs of toys, my son's toys. There's a 1952 Mickey Mouse with the original paint, a Dinky Toys Roadster in mint condition, still in its box, 3 tin soldiers from 1938, a Lionel train set that belonged to my father that my father gave to my son on his 6th birthday. All gone. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is the bank statement stapled to the back of the photos, the deposit, the date it was transferred. June 15th, 6 months ago. I close my eyes. I open them again. The lawyer is waiting for me to say something. I don't say anything yet. There's something else I haven't told him, something I've been keeping very quiet. Let me take you back to the version of me that still believed people were fundamentally good. I'm a legal consultant. I work for a firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone has a corner office or they're pretending they don't care that they don't. I'm good at what I do. I read contracts like other people read novels. I spot the lies in the fine print. I find the trapdoors before anyone falls through them. But I was blind at home. My name is Sarah. I'm 42 years old. I have a son named Marcus who was 9 years old when this started. He has his father's eyes dark brown, serious, like he's been thinking about something important his whole life. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, it means something. He reads about history. He collects things, not just toys, really, objects. He understands that things have stories, that they connect us to the past. He got that from my father. My father died 8 years ago. He was an antiques dealer, obsessive about condition, reports, and provenance, and the weight of old things in your hands. He spent the last 3 months of his life teaching Marcus about value, not market value, but real value. He showed him how to hold a tin soldier so the painted uniform didn't chip, how to wind the Lionel train so the gears didn't strip. He told Marcus that taking care of precious things was a form of love. My father gave Marcus the Lionel train set the week before he died. He knew. He'd known for months that he was running out of time, but he didn't tell anyone. He just decided that his grandson needed to inherit something that had belonged to his own father and his father's father before that. When my father died, Marcus cried once. At the funeral, he was a small 7-year-old in a suit that was too big, standing in the rain, and he cried. Then he didn't cry again. He went home and spent that entire first month checking on the train set every single day, rewinding it, checking all the pieces, making sure it was exactly as his grandfather had left it. For 2 years, he kept those toys perfect. I was a good mother in those years. I think. I worked, I came home, I helped with homework, I made dinner. There wasn't a lot of money, but there was enough. My ex-husband paid child support reliably. I had a decent apartment near Marcus's school. We had a routine. My parents lived 20 minutes away. My mother, Carol, was the kind of person who smiled in a way that looked genuine but never reached her eyes. My father, Michael, was already gone. My mother had remarried, a man named Douglas, a real estate developer who was always talking about investments and opportunities and leverage. Douglas saw possibility in everything. That was what my mother said she loved about him. He made her feel like everything was going somewhere. I should have paid more attention to that statement. It started in March. My mother called me at work. She does this sometimes, interrupts my day to tell me something that probably could have waited. Usually it's about a dinner she's planning, or a fight she had with her book club, or some minor frustration with Douglas. This time, she called to ask if I wanted to sell Marcus's toys. I remember I was reviewing a contract for a merger. My cursor was hovering over a problematic clause. I almost didn't understand what she was asking. His toys, I said. The collection, she said. The antiques. Douglas thinks they could be valuable. He knows a dealer, a private collector who handles high-end vintage toys. They're not for sale, I said. Not even for a good cause. Her voice had that certain quality, the one that meant she'd already decided something and was just going through the motions of asking me. I asked her what good cause. She told me about Douglas's new idea, a basketball court at the community center, a renovation project. It was going to cost $85,000, and Douglas was willing to put up half if they could raise the rest from donors and private sales of items they no longer needed. Items they no longer needed. Marcus's toys were not their items. I told her no. I told her very clearly, very calmly, that Marcus's toys were his inheritance from his great-grandfather, that they were not for sale under any circumstances, that I didn't care if Douglas was planning to build a rocket ship, those toys were not going anywhere. My mother said, "I understand," in a way that clearly meant she didn't, and she hung up. I went back to the contract. The problematic clause was actually simple, once you paid attention. Someone had buried a termination fee so deep in the document that a normal reader would never find it. But I'm not a normal reader. I'm the person you hire to find exactly these kinds of things, to read the truth beneath the words. I should have applied that skill to my mother's call. It was 3 weeks later that Marcus came home from school upset. He was quiet usually, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet that meant something had broken inside him. He went straight to his room, and I let him be for a while. Sometimes he just needed space to process things. But when I finally went to check on him, I found him sitting on his bed with his hands in his lap, staring at nothing. I asked him if something happened at school. He said, "Grandma told me the Lionel train wasn't in her garage anymore." My stomach did something that felt like falling. I called my mother immediately. She didn't pick up. I called again. And again. Finally, she texted, "We need to talk in person about this, not over the phone." That's when I knew. I drove to my mother's house an hour later. Marcus stayed with his neighbor, and I drove in silence, and by the time I pulled into their driveway, I'd already run through about 15 different scenarios in my head, none of them good. My mother answered the door. She was wearing her yoga clothes, which meant Douglas had probably told her I was coming, and she wanted to look casual, unrehearsed, like we were just going to have a normal conversation. "Where are they?" I asked. "Upstairs, let's sit down." "Where are they?" She took me to Douglas's office. That's where they'd been keeping them, apparently. Boxed up, cataloged, photographed. She showed me the photographs. Someone, a professional appraiser, she explained, had come and documented everything and assigned values to each item. The Lionel train set, $12,000. The 1952 Mickey Mouse, $4,500. Everything combined, just over $83,000. "We were planning to tell you," my mother said, "once the buyer had confirmed and the funds transferred. You sold them. We found a collector. He was very interested, and he understood the historical significance, and he's going to take beautiful care of them." I felt something happen in my chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder, something that looked at this situation and saw exactly what was underneath it. I asked her if she had actually already sold them. She didn't answer. I asked her when. She said, 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. She'd known for 3 weeks. She'd let me live for 3 weeks thinking the toys were just sitting in a box somewhere, retrievable. But they were already gone, already in someone else's collection, already becoming someone else's inheritance story. I remember walking out of the house. I remember my mother calling after me, saying things about Marcus being young, about him having other toys, about how the money was going to do real good in the community, about how I needed to think about the bigger picture. I got to the bottom of the stairs, and I turned around. I asked her very quietly if she had any idea what she'd done. Not the selling. Not the money or the basketball court or any of that. I meant, did she understand what she'd taken from Marcus? Did she understand that some things can't be replaced, that the act of stealing from your own grandson wasn't just about the toys, It was about the promise embedded in them, that those toys meant his great-grandfather was still here, still taking care of him, still proving that love survives. Did she understand that she'd killed that? My mother's face changed. For just a second, I saw something flicker across it. Recognition, maybe, or guilt. But then it was gone, and in its place was the same smiling expression I'd known my whole life, the one that looked real but never quite reached the eyes. "I think you're overreacting," she said. That was the moment I stopped being angry. That was the moment I got very, very quiet. The next week, everything fell apart in the way that seems random and unconnected, but absolutely isn't. My firm's senior partner called me into his office on Monday. He had a concerned expression, the kind that meant someone had already decided the outcome and was just going through the performance of having a conversation. He said that a client had called him over the weekend, claiming that I'd misrepresented a contract term during a consultation last month. It was the Hartwell merger, the exact one I was working on when my mother called about the toys. The client was claiming that I'd told them the termination clause wasn't significant, that it shouldn't influence their decision-making. They were saying I'd given them bad advice, intentionally, and now that the merger had gone through, they discovered the true cost of that clause and were looking for damages. I knew immediately that it wasn't true. I knew this because I'd documented everything. I'd sent the client a detailed email, flagged in red, explaining exactly what that clause meant and what the financial implications were. I'd even included a recommendation that they hire independent legal counsel to review it. The email was dated and time-stamped and crystal clear. I told the partner exactly this. I offered to show him the email thread. He said, "That's good," in the tone that meant it wasn't actually good. But the client is saying they never received it. I pulled the email up right there in his office. Sent to Hartwell, contract at company, com on February 18th at 2:47 p.m. "That's not the client email," the partner said. "The client is saying the contact who received this email wasn't actually authorized to make decisions. You should have contacted their VP of Finance directly." I felt the walls tighten around me. The truth was a small thing now. The truth was that, yes, I'd sent it to the contact person who was supposed to be the decision maker. In 3 years of working with that client, that's exactly how our communication had worked. That was the protocol they'd established. But none of that mattered now. None of it protected me. The partner gave me a suspension pending investigation. 2 weeks. They'd do an internal review. The client was considering legal action. The firm was going to have to distance themselves from me until this was resolved. I walked out of his office with my keys and my personal items and a stack of documents signed by someone in HR. I didn't cry. I went home and I picked Marcus up from aftercare and I didn't mention any of it. I made dinner. I helped with homework. I put him to bed and I sat in the kitchen and I opened my laptop. I logged into my email account and I pulled up the entire Hartwell correspondence thread. I traced it from the first communication all the way through to the most recent exchange, and then I searched for a pattern. It took me 40 minutes to find it. Someone had accessed my email account and deleted the thread from the recipient's mailbox. It was still in my sent folder. Gmail kept copies, but from their side, the conversation had been erased, systematically. I knew how to do that, technically, but more importantly, I knew who had the skill and the access to make it look like my email client protocol had been wrong. My mother had remarried a man named Douglas who owned several real estate development companies and had numerous business contacts. Douglas also had a nephew who worked in IT security. Douglas also had a lot of invested interest in making sure I didn't become an obstacle to his plans. Or maybe I was being paranoid. I decided to check something. I went back through my client emails and I looked at the IP addresses. I was looking for anything that seemed off, anything that suggested external tampering. And I found something. On February 15th, 3 days before I sent that contract analysis, someone had logged into my work email account from an IP address that didn't belong to our office building. It was a residential IP. It was from a zip code in my mother's neighborhood. 3 days later, my career imploded. I printed everything. I organized it in chronological order. I made a timeline with dates and IP addresses and email headers. I showed it to a forensic IT specialist I knew from law school, and he confirmed that yes, someone had accessed my account without authorization and systematically deleted certain threads from the recipient's side while leaving copies in my sent folder. Someone had framed me. The question was, why? I called my mother the next day. I asked her if Douglas's nephew had access to her home internet. She asked me what on earth I was talking about. I told her that someone had accessed my work email and deleted correspondence and framed me for giving bad legal advice, which had cost me my job and my reputation at my firm. I asked her if she wanted to know my theory about who did it. She said, "Sarah, you're grieving. You're upset about Marcus and the toys. You're not thinking clearly. You need to calm down." That word, calm, like my reasoned analysis of evidence, was hysteria. I said, "I'm completely calm." And I was. That was what scared her, I think, that I wasn't screaming at her or crying or falling apart. I was just standing there, very quiet, very still, with a timeline of someone's betrayal in my hand. "I didn't do anything," my mother said. I asked her if Douglas did. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You sold my son's inheritance," I said. "And then when I called you on it, someone accessed my work email and destroyed my career. That's a lot of coincidences, Mom." She hung up. I tried to file a police report, but the evidence was technical and complicated, and the officer I spoke to looked like he didn't really understand what I was describing. He took my statement and said they'd look into it, which meant they wouldn't. I contacted the firm's compliance office and showed them the IP evidence. They said it was inconclusive and that they'd need formal law enforcement involvement to reopen the investigation, which law enforcement wouldn't do because they thought I was being paranoid. I was trapped in a perfect circle of evidence that no one would acknowledge. And then 2 days after I tried to file the report, my apartment's security deposit was disputed. My landlord said I'd damaged the walls and broken the dishwasher and left permanent stains on the carpet. He was keeping the entire deposit. When I asked for evidence, he said he was sending photographs. They never arrived, but he did send an email to the property management company characterizing me as a difficult tenant who was prone to unstable outbursts. I'd never had a single interaction with this landlord. Then my car insurance company called and said there'd been a claim filed against my policy. Someone had reported an accident I'd never been in. They were investigating, but if the claim was legitimate, my rates would triple and my coverage might be canceled. It was like watching someone methodically dismantle everything. My job was gone. My reputation was damaged. My housing situation was becoming unstable. My finances were being attacked from multiple angles. I realized, at that point, exactly what was happening. This wasn't just about the toys. This wasn't about Marcus or my father's inheritance or even my mother's choices. This was Douglas systematically attempting to isolate me, to make me look unstable, to make it so that when I tried to speak up about what had happened, everyone would already believe I was the problem. He was gaslighting me on a macro scale, using my own professional life as the tool. And my mother was letting it happen. Or, more likely, my mother had asked for it to happen. That's when the cold clarity I'd been feeling since my mother said she didn't do anything crystallized into something sharper. That's when I stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. I called my firm and told them I was hiring an attorney to represent me through the investigation. I didn't mention the IP address evidence or the tampering. I said I was concerned about due process and wanted legal counsel present for all communications. What I was actually doing was creating a paper trail. If they knew I had legal representation, they'd have to communicate through my lawyer, which meant they'd have to be careful, which meant they might actually look at my evidence. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Chen who specialized in employment disputes and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless with discovery. She charged $1,500 for the initial consultation. I didn't have that kind of money anymore, but I had a credit card, and I was going to deal with that reality later. In that first meeting with Rebecca, I told her everything. The toys, the access to my email, the frame job, the car insurance, the apartment, all of it. I laid it out like a contract I was analyzing, showing her all the connections, all the breadcrumbs that led back to Douglas. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Prove it." I said, "I have the email headers. I have the timeline. I have the IP address logs." "IP addresses are easy to spoof," she said. "You need something harder. You need proof that they knew what they were doing. You need communication, emails, texts, conversations. You need them talking about it." I asked her how I was supposed to get that. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd spent years finding loopholes in the law. "You need to talk to them," she said, "and you need to record it." I was in Pennsylvania, which is a two-party consent state. Recording someone without their knowledge was a felony. Rebecca said that was technically true, but that Pennsylvania also allowed for one-party consent in situations where the recordist was a party to the conversation and had a reasonable expectation that what was being discussed was relevant to a criminal investigation. She was suggesting I break the law, but she was also suggesting I do it smart enough that it wouldn't blow back on me. I asked her to explain exactly how that would work. She told me to set up a meeting with Douglas, face to face, and to record it with a device small enough that he wouldn't see it. She gave me the name of a company that sold recording pens, professional surveillance equipment. "Get him talking," she said. "Get him to admit something, anything, then we have leverage." She said the word, leverage, the way my mother's new husband said it. I bought the recording pen the next day. I also bought a second phone, an old smartphone on a prepaid plan, untraceable. I set up a Google Voice number using a fake email account. I researched how to make my original email address look compromised, how to create the appearance of a security breach that would prompt IT departments to investigate. I was learning things I didn't know I needed to know. And while I was learning those things, I was also very carefully creating the appearance of falling apart. I called Marcus's school and told them I was going through some personal issues and that if my son seemed distressed, they should let me know. I wanted them watching him. I wanted documentation that I was concerned about his well-being, that I was a careful mother. I reached out to a counselor and scheduled weekly sessions. I told the counselor that my family had betrayed me and that I was worried about the impact on my son. I made sure the counselor's notes reflected my concern and my stability and my dedication to Marcus's emotional health. I was building a psychological profile in real time. I was creating evidence of my own good character while simultaneously building a case against my mother and Douglas. It took 2 weeks for me to reach out to Douglas. I sent him an email from my fake Google Voice account. I told him I was a documentary filmmaker interested in his real estate ventures. I said I'd seen his vision for the community center basketball court, and I wanted to profile him as an example of a philanthropist who uses creative problem-solving to accomplish community goals. He responded within 4 hours. Of course he did. He was the exact type of person who would respond to flattery, who would see an opportunity to be profiled and highlighted and celebrated, and who would jump at it. We arranged to meet at his office the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend before that meeting practicing what I would say. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I practiced my voice being soft, vulnerable, slightly admiring. I practiced asking him questions about his vision, about his business strategy, about how he'd come to understand the power of leverage and opportunity. I practiced getting him to talk about my mother. I practiced until I didn't have to practice anymore. The night before the meeting, I lay in bed and I didn't sleep, and I thought about Marcus. About his small, serious face when I'd told him that his toys had belonged to his great-grandfather. About the way he'd nodded, like he already understood that some things mattered more than other things. I thought about my father's hands, teaching my son how to wind a train set. I thought about the moment my mother said, "I think you're overreacting." And I felt the cold thing inside me get even colder. It wasn't anger anymore, it was precision. Part 6, Secret Preparation, 2632 MINUTES. The pen was smaller than I expected. It was about the size of an actual pen, weighing almost nothing, with a tiny recording device inside that could run for 8 hours on a full battery. I charged it all morning, and I practiced clicking it on and off until I could do it without thinking about it. I wore the pen in my jacket pocket during the meeting. Douglas's office was exactly what I would have predicted. All glass and steel and carefully chosen modern art that looked expensive but meant nothing. He was a big man, tall, with the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. He shook my hand with the grip of someone who thought firmness proved honesty. I'd seen his type in 1,000 corporate boardrooms. They always underestimated women who seemed impressed. I told him I was fascinated by his philosophy of community investment. I asked him how he identified opportunities, how he knew when something was worth pursuing. He got comfortable very quickly. He told me that the key was understanding what people needed, what they wanted, and where the gap between those two things created opportunity. He said that most people were so focused on their own problems that they couldn't see the bigger picture. That was where smart people came in. Smart people could see the larger system and manipulate it to create outcomes that benefited everyone. He used the word manipulate so naturally that I almost laughed. I asked him about the basketball court. How did he come up with that idea? He said it was part of a larger strategy. The community center was underperforming. Property values in the surrounding area were stagnant. But if they could revitalize the community center, make it a destination, the whole neighborhood would benefit. Property values would go up. Developers could move in. The area would experience growth. "So you're not actually helping the community," I said. It was a question phrased like an observation. "You're setting up conditions for gentrification." He didn't even flinch. "Of course," he said. "Why do you think anyone really does anything? It's not about altruism. It's about creating favorable conditions for your own interests. You just have to be smart enough to frame it in a way that makes other people feel good about it." He was proud of this. He was proud of the cynicism. He saw it as sophistication. I asked him, who had provided the funds for the basketball court, how had he raised the money? He said, "My wife's family had some items they were willing to part with. Antiques, toys, actually, valuable collectibles. There was a private buyer very interested in that sort of thing." My hands were very still. I kept them on the table. I kept my voice light. "That sounds like a convenient solution," I said. "It was perfect, actually," he said. "My stepdaughter had been giving us problems, ungrateful, defensive about her father's things, even though she has no respect for real value, for understanding investment and growth. Her ex-husband wasn't paying child support consistently. Her son was just sitting around with a collection of useless toys while she struggled with bills. So we identified a win-win. We found a buyer for the toys. We raised half the funds for the court. And frankly, we did her a favor by removing her from an emotional attachment to objects that were clearly distorting her priorities." I felt something cold move through my chest. He just described stealing from a child as doing her a favor. I asked him if my mother knew that the toys had belonged to Marcus. If she understood what she'd taken from him. "Your mother," he said, "understands business. She understands that emotional attachment to things is a weakness. That's actually why we had to take action when we did. Your fathers will have left some items to your son, and we knew you'd fight us legally if we tried to sell them. So we moved quickly, presented it as a family gift. She agreed because deep down, she knows I'm right about most things." I asked him if there was anything he was worried about, any comeback, any legal exposure. He laughed. He actually laughed. "From you," he said. "You're barely employed. Your reputation at your firm is destroyed. Your landlord is documenting your instability. Your car insurance company is investigating you. You're in no position to do anything to me. And honestly, even if you were, who would believe you? You've already shown that you're unstable, unreasonable, prone to obsessing over inanimate objects. You're the exact kind of person who makes wild accusations that no one takes seriously. He was describing the system he'd built around me. I reached up and touched the pen in my pocket, just to confirm it was still recording. "Thank you for your time," I said. I stood up. He said, "Are you sure? I thought you wanted to talk about the documentary." "I got what I needed," I said. His face changed. For just a second, I saw him try to understand if he'd said something wrong. Then the moment passed and he was smiling again, dismissing me, already turning his attention to something else. I walked out of his office and I got into my car, and I drove home very carefully, very slowly, obeying every traffic law. The recording was 43 minutes long. He'd confessed to everything: the toys, the plan to isolate me, the coordination with my landlord. He mentioned calling a contact at the management company to file a complaint. The insurance claim, apparently that was the work of someone he knew in claims adjustments. He'd told me exactly how the system worked, exactly how much a few phone calls could dismantle a person's life when that person was already vulnerable. And he'd told me that my mother knew, that she'd agreed, that she'd understood it was happening. I listened to the recording twice. Then I made a copy. Then I made another copy. Then I encrypted them and uploaded them to 3 separate cloud services using accounts he couldn't trace. The next day, I took the recording to Rebecca. She listened to the entire 43 minutes. When it finished, she sat back in her chair and she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "He's a predator," she said, "and he's documented himself being one." I asked her what we could do with the recording. "Technically," she said, "it's inadmissible in most courts because of the recording statute, but that doesn't mean we can't use it." She explained her strategy to me. We couldn't use the recording in a legal proceeding, but we could use it to prompt people to investigate. We could send it to the police, to the insurance company, to the management company. We could send it to journalists. We could use it to convince people to look at the other evidence: the email tampering, the IP addresses, the coordination of various attacks on my life. In other words, we could use the truth to create enough pressure that the lie would collapse. I asked her if there was a legal risk for me. "Technically, yes," she said, "but I've already thought about how to minimize it." She told me her plan. She said we were going to file a lawsuit, not for defamation, but for fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress and interference with employment. We were going to name Douglas and my mother as defendants, and we were going to use the discovery process to get them to produce the documentation of how they'd coordinated their attacks. In the process of that lawsuit, they'd have to respond to detailed interrogatories. They'd have to tell the truth under oath about what they'd done. And if they lied, we had the recordings to prove it. "Once they're under oath," Rebecca said, "the game changes. Once they have to answer questions for a record, the coordinated story falls apart." She was describing a trap, I realized, a legal trap. I asked her how much this would cost. She named a number that made my stomach sink, but then she said, "You're going to win this lawsuit, and they're going to pay your attorney's fees. So really, they're funding your own destruction." I couldn't help it. I smiled. We filed the lawsuit on a Thursday morning in November. By Friday afternoon, my mother had called me 17 times. Part 7, the big twist, 3235 MINUTES. I didn't answer any of her calls. Instead, I watched the legal filings spread through the system. I watched the discovery process begin. I watched my mother and Douglas's lawyers scramble to figure out what they were actually going to say in response to interrogatories that were specifically designed to force them to explain their coordinated harassment of me and my son. But that's not the twist. The twist came when I was going through some old financial documents, preparing for a deposition. I was organizing receipts, bank statements, Anything that might be relevant to demonstrating the emotional and financial impact of losing Marcus's toys and my job. I found a bank transfer. It was from my father's account, dated 6 days before he died. It was to my mother, $500,000. I called the bank and I explained the situation, and they confirmed that yes, such a transfer had occurred. My father, in the final week of his life, had transferred $500,000 to my mother. There was no will amendment, no explanation in his actual will about this transfer, no documentation at all about why he'd done it. I looked at the dates again. My father died 8 years ago. My mother had been sitting on $500,000 for 8 years. I drove to my mother's house that night. I didn't call first. I just drove there and I knocked on the door. She opened it, and the moment she saw my face, she knew. "The money," I said. She tried to close the door. I put my foot in the gap. "The money Dad left you," I said. "Was it ever intended to go to me, to Marcus, or did you always plan to keep it?" She said, "That's not your business." "It's my business if you used that money to fund the campaign against me," I said. "It's my business if you took $500,000 that was supposed to build my life or my son's life, and instead used it to destroy me." She tried to close the door again. I said, "Did Douglas know about the money? Is that why he married you? Is that why he was willing to orchestrate all of this? Not because you asked him to, but because he was already planning to steal from you the way you stole from me?" Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, fear. "He's going to take everything," I said, "and you're going to deserve it." I pulled my foot back, and I let her close the door. I drove home, and I called Rebecca, and I told her what I'd found. "This changes things," she said. "Not legally, the money transfer is a separate issue, but psychologically, this is a revelation. This is your mother having the means to make things right and choosing not to. This is premeditation. This is showing that she planned this entire betrayal years ago." She told me to get everything about that money transfer into my deposition testimony. She told me to make sure it was on the record. She told me that juries love a good hidden money trail. But there was something else, she said, something that had just occurred to her. "Have you asked yourself why Douglas married your mother in the first place?" she asked. I hadn't. "Look into his other marriages," she said. "His business history, see if there's a pattern." It took me 6 hours of searching through property records and business filings and marriage licenses to understand. Douglas had been married 3 times before my mother. Each time, he'd married women with money or property. Each time, he'd had some kind of legal conflict with their families over finances. Each time, he'd walked away richer. My mother was wife number 4, and she was the richest one yet. She didn't just have $500,000. She had more. She had investments, property, retirement accounts. She had the entire inheritance from her parents, which she'd never mentioned to me. She was, I realized, worth approximately $2 million. And Douglas had married her specifically because of that. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd understood. My mother hadn't just chosen to steal from Marcus and conspire against me. She'd been prey in her own right. She'd been targeted by a predator who'd seen her loneliness after my father died and recognized it as an opportunity. I felt something strange then, not quite sympathy, but understanding, maybe, recognition that my mother had also been played. That didn't change anything she'd done. It didn't unsteal the toys or undo the attacks on my life. But it did mean that the system I was building wasn't just revenge against my mother. It was going to expose Douglas for what he was. And maybe, just maybe, it would save the next woman he targeted. The deposition happened in Rebecca's office on a cold morning in January. My mother was there with her lawyer. Douglas was in a separate room, being deposed at the same time. The questions we'd posed in discovery required them to respond specifically and in writing under oath about their coordination of the harassment. Rebecca started with the easy questions. My mother confirmed that yes, she'd sold Marcus's toys. She confirmed that she'd known I was opposed to the sale. She confirmed that she'd proceeded anyway. Then Rebecca asked her about the money. You received $500,000 from your husband's estate approximately 8 years ago, Rebecca said. Can you tell us what you did with those funds? My mother's lawyer told her not to answer until they reviewed the question. It's straightforward, Rebecca said. $500,000, where did it go? My mother said, it was my inheritance. I could do what I wanted with it. I didn't ask if you could, Rebecca said. I asked what you did. Did you give any of it to your daughter, to your grandson? No. Did you inform your daughter that this money existed? No. Why? Because I didn't want to. Rebecca let that hang in the room for a moment. Then she asked my mother if she'd used any of that money to fund the basketball court project. My mother said no. She said Douglas had funded the basketball court. They just provided the items for sale to raise additional funds. Rebecca asked her if she'd given any money to Douglas, for the basketball court, for any reason. My mother's lawyer objected. Rebecca overruled him and asked the question again. My mother said, not directly. Rebecca asked what that meant. My husband and I share finances, my mother said. Some of my money has been used for mutual projects, yes. So Douglas had access to your inheritance, Rebecca said. The $500,000 your husband left you. Yes. And you gave him access to that money, while simultaneously authorizing him to sell your grandson's possessions and coordinate a campaign to discredit and isolate your daughter. I didn't authorize any campaign, my mother said. You discussed the toys with Douglas, Rebecca said. You told him they were valuable. You agreed to sell them. Yes. And did you have any conversations with Douglas about ways to discourage your daughter from making trouble over the sale? My mother looked at her lawyer. Her lawyer told her she didn't have to answer. Rebecca said, let me rephrase. Did you, at any point, discuss your daughter's potential legal response with Douglas? I may have mentioned that she might be upset, my mother said. And did Douglas express any ideas about how to prevent her from taking legal action? My mother didn't answer. Rebecca waited. Finally, my mother said, he may have suggested that she had other problems to worry about. There it was. That was the confirmation, the coordination, the moment of admission. Rebecca repeated it back to her for the record. She asked my mother to elaborate on what those problems were. My mother said, her employment situation, some issues with her housing arrangement. Issues that Douglas helped create, Rebecca said. I don't know that, my mother said. You don't know that your husband engineered the loss of your daughter's job and the disputes with her landlord, Rebecca asked. Your own husband didn't discuss those activities with you. My mother's face had gone very pale. My husband and I don't discuss every detail of our lives, she said. But you do discuss ways to discredit your daughter while he's attacking her professionally and housing-wise, Rebecca said. You do discuss selling her son's possessions to fund projects you both benefit from, that level of detail you're comfortable with. Rebecca didn't need a response to that. She'd made her point for the record. The next day, it was Douglas's deposition. He came in with an expensive lawyer. He was confident. He'd probably been through depositions before. He thought he understood the game. Rebecca started by asking him about the basketball court. When had the idea originated? How had he come to partner with the community center? Douglas gave a long answer about philanthropic vision and community reinvestment. It was smooth. It was practiced. Rebecca asked him about the funding sources. How had he identified the antiques to sell? My wife mentioned that her family had some valuable collectibles, he said. Did she tell you who owned them? They were in her family. Specifically, did she tell you they belonged to her grandson? Douglas said he believed the items had been stored at her residence. Rebecca asked him if ownership and storage were the same thing. Not generally, he said. So even though these toys belonged to her grandson, your wife gave you permission to sell them? I believe she did, yes. And did you compensate the grandson? Did you offer to explain to a 9-year-old child that his great-grandfather's inheritance was being sold. That wasn't my responsibility, Douglas said. Whose responsibility was it? Rebecca asked. My wife's. She's his grandmother. But you proposed the scheme, correct? You're the one who identified the value. You're the one who found the buyer. You're the one who arranged the transfer. Douglas didn't answer. I want to move to another topic, Rebecca said. Your professional relationship with a property management company that handles residential leasing in the downtown area. Can you tell me about that relationship? Douglas said he knew some people in the property management business. Did you contact any of those people regarding my client's rental property? I don't recall, he said. Rebecca showed him an email. It was from Douglas to the property management company's director, sent the day after my first call to my mother about the toys. It didn't mention me by name, but it did describe a tenant causing problems, a person who was prone to emotional instability, and asked if perhaps the management company should review the lease for any discrepancies in the property condition. Can you explain what you meant by that email? Rebecca asked. I don't recall sending that, Douglas said. Rebecca showed him the email metadata. It was from his work address, the time stamp, the subject line in his handwriting. I may have been providing advice to a business associate, Douglas said. I don't recall the specific context. You were providing advice to discredit my client, Rebecca said. That's not accurate, Douglas said. And then, approximately 10 days later, my client received a notice from the management company claiming she damaged the property. Did you have any communication with the management company about that notice? Douglas didn't answer. Rebecca asked him about the insurance claim, about a claim filed against my client's auto insurance that was later found to be fraudulent. Douglas said he had no knowledge of that. Rebecca showed him another email. This one was from Douglas to a friend who worked in insurance claims. It was vague, just a mention of a friend's daughter who was having trouble. Could his friend maybe look into whether she had any claims on file that might be worth examining? Does this ring a bell? Rebecca asked. I help a lot of people, Douglas said. And one of those people you helped was yourself, Rebecca said. You helped yourself to my client's career, her housing, her peace of mind, all while your wife helped herself to her grandson's inheritance, all while you were stealing from my client's mother, because that's what you were doing, isn't it? You were using your wife's inheritance as leverage, trying to establish control over her assets before eventually divorcing her and taking everything. Douglas's lawyer told him not to answer. Rebecca asked the question again. She asked Douglas how many previous wives he'd had, how many of those divorces had involved financial disputes, how many of those women had ended up fighting him for years in courts over access to their own money. Douglas's lawyer said they were done for the day. Rebecca said, I have 17 more questions prepared about patterns of financial manipulation and documented fraud. Douglas stood up and left. The lawsuit settled 3 weeks later. Douglas's lawyers came to Rebecca with an offer. They would settle the fraud and emotional distress claims for $250,000. Douglas would make a statement to the police regarding the coordinated harassment. He would cooperate with insurance investigations into the fraudulent claims. And he would agree to a permanent injunction, preventing him from contacting me or Marcus. In exchange, I would agree not to press criminal charges for the unauthorized access to my email, which technically I could have done. Rebecca told me it was a good offer. She said Douglas's lawyers knew their client was exposed, that there was enough evidence to prove systematic fraud, and that they wanted to get ahead of criminal prosecution. I asked her what happened to him if we didn't settle. She said he goes to trial, he loses, and then probably he goes to jail for a while, depending on what the criminal investigation turns up. I asked her about my mother. Rebecca said, your mother's liability is more complicated. She's guilty of conspiracy and possibly fraud, but her role was more passive. She agreed to something her husband suggested. In a trial, we could prove she was complicit, which would hurt her, but it might not result in jail time. I asked if the settlement was the right choice. Rebecca said, The settlement guarantees you money, justice on the record, and closure. A trial guarantees uncertainty and extended trauma. Most people in your position choose the settlement. I asked what she would do. She smiled. I'd take the settlement. I'd watch him go through a criminal investigation, and I'd use the $250,000 to buy back Marcus's toys from the private collector. It took me 30 seconds to process what she'd just said. Can we do that? I asked. That, Rebecca said, would be a beautiful ending. It turned out the collector was a wealthy man in Connecticut who'd purchased the toys as an investment. He'd kept them perfect, documented, insured. He'd actually done exactly what Douglas and my mother had promised. He'd taken beautiful care of them. When I contacted him and explained the situation, he was horrified. He said he'd had no idea the toys had been stolen from a child. He said he'd purchased them in good faith from a dealer, and he understood if I wanted to pursue legal remedies. But he also said that if I could prove they were stolen, he'd be willing to negotiate a return. I sent him documentation of the lawsuit. I sent him the deposition transcripts where Douglas admitted the sale had been conducted to isolate me. I sent him photographs of Marcus's collection journal, where he documented every toy, every story, every detail. The collector called me back 2 days later. He said his team had authenticated the toys and confirmed they were authentic and in perfect condition. He said he'd sell them back to me for the price he'd paid for them, which turned out to be $65,000. The settlement was $250,000. I used $65,000 to buy back the toys. I used another $30,000 to hire a forensic accountant to trace my father's actual intentions with the inheritance money. I used $50,000 to cover the legal fees I'd already incurred. I used $30,000 to set up a college fund for Marcus in my father's name. The remaining $65,000 I put into a trust account, locked against myself, with strict instructions that it could only be used for Marcus's education or in cases of genuine emergency. 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I had the toys delivered to my apartment. I didn't open the boxes right away. I waited until Marcus came home from school, and then I took him into his room and I showed him. He didn't cry. He rarely cried, my son, but he picked up the Lionel train set very carefully, like it was something alive. He held it the way his great-grandfather had taught him to hold it, and he rewound it very slowly, checking each gear. "Grandpa," he asked. I said yes. Grandpa was still here. Grandpa was always here, in these things, in the care we took of them, in the refusal to let them disappear. Marcus set the train down, and he hugged me. It was the first time he'd hugged me in 3 months. I held him, and I didn't cry either. My mother called me once, after the settlement. She wanted to know if I could forgive her. She told me that Douglas had already started the process of separating their finances, that she'd discovered he'd been secretly transferring her money to accounts she couldn't access, that she was filing for divorce. I didn't say anything harsh. I didn't gloat or tell her she deserved it. I just said that she'd made a choice to believe a man who'd told her what she wanted to hear over her own daughter, who'd been honest with her about her concerns. That choices had consequences, that I couldn't forgive her yet, but maybe someday I could understand her. She asked if I could understand her now. I said no, not yet. She hung up. I never heard from her again. Douglas received a prosecution offer from the state 6 months later. In exchange for his guilty plea to wire fraud and unauthorized computer access, his sentence would be reduced. He pleaded guilty. He served 2 years in a federal minimum security facility. When he got out, his ex-wife had already divorced him and taken back the money he'd been trying to hide. He never contacted me. It's been 4 years now. I got my job back. It took 6 months of the internal investigation process, but once they reviewed the deposition transcripts and the email evidence, the firm realized what had happened. They reinstated me, they apologized, they gave me a raise and a promotion to senior counsel. Marcus is 13 now. He's a freshman in high school. He still collects things, but he's more discriminating about it now. He understands the difference between accumulation and curation. He understands that value isn't just monetary, it's historical, it's personal, it's the stories embedded in objects. He still winds the Lionel train set every Sunday. He's written a research paper about vintage toy preservation that won first place in his school's history fair. I'm still a legal consultant, but I changed firms. I work for a company that specializes in family law and fraud cases. I'm very good at finding the lies buried in contracts and communications. I'm even better at recognizing when someone is gaslighting a client, when someone is systematically dismantling another person's credibility. I've helped 17 people build cases against family members or partners who have betrayed them. 3 of them are currently in active lawsuits. 16 of them have documentation of their abusers' crimes on record. Rebecca became my mentor. Then she became my friend. We have lunch every other Thursday and we talk about cases and strategy and the particular cruelty of people who betray the people closest to them. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I just accepted my mother's decision. If I'd let her steal from Marcus and moved on, tried to be the bigger person, tried to preserve the family relationship. I think I would have become someone bitter and small. I think Marcus would have learned that his inheritance didn't matter. I think my mother would have learned that she could take anything and suffer no consequences. Instead, she learned otherwise. Instead, I learned that the coldest, most effective revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet. It's methodical. It's building an airtight case and letting the truth speak for itself. It's refusing to be gaslit into believing that you're the problem when the problem is actually the people who are trying to destroy you. It's not letting them win. Last week, Marcus asked me why I'd fought so hard about the toys. He said most parents would have just bought him new ones. I told him that I wasn't fighting about the toys. I was fighting because someone had tried to make me believe that I was crazy for caring. Someone had tried to make me think that my love for him and my respect for his inheritance didn't matter. I told him that once someone successfully gaslights you into believing you're wrong about something you know is right, they can gaslight you about anything. The toys were just the beginning. He nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. He probably did. He picked up a toy soldier from his collection, and he asked me if I thought his great-grandfather would be proud of him now. I said yes. I said I knew he would be. Marcus set the soldier down very carefully, and he went back to his homework. And I sat there in the quiet of our apartment, and I thought about my father, about the way he'd taught us both to hold precious things, to preserve them, to refuse to let them disappear. He'd been teaching us about more than just toys. He'd been teaching us about standing firm when someone tried to take what was ours. He'd been teaching us about the cost of love and the price of betrayal. He'd been teaching us, without saying it out loud, that some people will underestimate you. Some people will think you're weak because you're quiet, or intelligent because you don't shout, or fragile because you care. But those people are wrong. The strongest people are the ones who can sit in the cold clarity of their own pain, and instead of exploding, they can methodically build a case against the people who caused that pain. The strongest people are the ones who refuse to be gaslit, who refuse to believe the narrative someone else is building, who refuse to accept that they're crazy for knowing the truth. The strongest people are the ones who win quietly. And that, I've learned, is the only kind of revenge that actually matters.